Hi everyone, my name is Tia Kelly and today I'll be doing a presentation on the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, also known as CAPTA, C-A-P-T-A. This act was created to address the increasingly problematic issue of child abuse in the U.S. This act specifically, as you can see on the screen, is to provide financial assistance for a demonstration program for the prevention, identification, and treatment of child abuse. It's also for several other purposes like dissemination of information and other things like that, which we'll address later on in the presentation. It was enacted in 1974 by Congress and has been updated several times since, with the most recent update being in 2018. That update was actually approved in the most recent session this year in 2024. So in this presentation, we'll look at a few things like what's contained in the legislation, the details associated with the content, and at the overall concern of child abuse in general. So there are several different types of child abuse, many in fact, but on the screen we just have the common types of child abuse, and these are what are generally referred to in the legislation itself. So we've got neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological maltreatment, medical neglect, and other forms of maltreatment. I'll just go through each and give you a little definition and talk about them a little bit. So for neglect, it's the most common type of child abuse that is seen and investigated. So one child advocacy group defines neglect as the failure of a parent or caretaker to provide needed food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision to the degree that the child's health, safety, and well-being are threatened with harm. So the New York City Children's Department actually gives several examples of these, which might include failure to provide adequate food, clothing, or shelter, failure to provide medical or mental health care, leaving a child alone without proper supervision, subjecting a child to humiliation, fear, verbal terror, extreme criticism, those types of things, using corporal punishment, which is a little bit controversial, but if it's past an objectively reasonable standard, then it can be considered child abuse. Other things like exposing the child to family violence or exposing the child to drugs, keeping the child out of school, so issues with truancy or delinquency, not supporting their educational needs in general, that can all lead to a finding of child abuse. So those are just a few examples, but the list on child abuse is very, very extensive, and it may include any combination of those types or other types of abuse. The next type of abuse is physical abuse. This is kind of what's commonly thought of when you talk about child abuse, and it's anything that's like a physical altercation that results in a physical injury to a child or to an adolescent. So types of physical abuse may include things like physical punishment that goes too far, bruising, breaking bones, physical assault, anything like that that's committed against a child by a caretaker or a member in the home. Sometimes it occurs outside of the home as well, but that's more rare and isn't seen quite as much. It's usually somebody that the child knows or is related to. The National Children's Hospital reports that all physical abuse, but particularly head trauma, can cause long-lasting symptoms and effects in the growth and development of a child. And these effects can be both physical and psychological in nature, which often lead to exponential costs like medical care and things that really usually get taxed to the government, which is why it's an issue that's usually addressed in this type of legislation. So the next type of abuse is sexual abuse. That's another common one that people think about when they think about child abuse. So that one can be defined as and this is from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It's defined as any interaction between a child and an adult or another child in which the child is used for sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or an observer. So sexual abuse, it can involve a few things. It can either be touching or non-touching. So when I'm talking about non-touching, I'm talking about things like exhibitionism, voyeurism, exposure to child pornography, that sort of thing. And just to define those, voyeurism is when an adult tries to look at a child's naked body. Exhibitionism is when the perpetrator gets sexual gratification from showing their private parts to a child. And exposing a child to pornography is just as it sounds. Either you are exposing the child to images or videos or that sort of thing of child pornography, or you're actually including the child or putting the child into those pornographic materials, so to speak. And that's seen often with sexual abuse as well. So children of all ages can be victims of sexual abuse. Some abuse starts as early, and this is really terrible, but some abuse starts as early as a few days or a few weeks old, all the way up into adulthood. That's really terrible. Sorry to bring all of that up on there. But the next type of child abuse is psychological maltreatment. Psychological maltreatment, it has to do more with the psychological nature of abuse, so emotional type abuse and that sort of thing. It can be defined as a repeated pattern of extreme a repeated pattern or extreme incident of caretaker behavior that thwarts the child's basic psychological needs, so safety, socialization, worthfulness, basically anything that makes them feel like they're worthless, defective, damaged, unloved, unwanted, anything like that can be considered psychological maltreatment or emotional abuse or neglect. And to really put that into layman's term, it just means that psychological maltreatment is a form of emotional abuse on a child. Another type of common child abuse would be medical neglect. So the American Academy of Pediatrics defines that as either a failure to heed obvious signs of serious illness or failure to follow a physician's instructions once medical advice has been sought. That's commonly seen in the denial of basic medical needs of children. So to give an example, from working at DCS, I have seen a child, for instance, who has diabetes, and a parent, either doesn't believe in modern medicine or isn't cognizant enough because of, alcohol or drugs to really get the child with diabetes the medication that they need. So they deny that diabetic child the insulin that they need to survive. So that can be considered medical neglect. It can also be seen in other things like Munchausen's by proxy. You may have known of that because of the popularized show on Gypsy Rose Blanchard. She's kind of coming back to the media scene right now. But that's another type of medical neglect, which can be, causing medical issues, or if medical issues are there, just denying the needs that they need. Other forms of maltreatment can be anything like bullying, cyberbullying, sexual exploitation, child sex trafficking, criminal exploitation, if the kids are getting involved in gangs, female genital mutilation, grooming online or in person, all of these other things. There are lots and lots and lots of forms of maltreatment and child abuse in general. So this is not an exhaustive list, just things that are commonly seen when investigated. So moving on in our presentation, we'll talk a little bit about statistics on child abuse. So as you can see, more than 600,000 children are abused in the U.S. each year. That is from claims that are substantiated, meaning that the claims are confirmed through agencies like DCS, CPS, different sorts of things like that. But child abuse, it's surprisingly common. It's a common issue in the United States, and more than 3 million families are investigated every year by Child Protective Services. Child abuse, it's something that we've all heard about and may have even experienced ourselves. So it can oftentimes be a deadly occurrence. So approximately, a little bit over 1,800 children die each year from abuse in the U.S. And because of its prevalence, and really the negative consequences that can come from it, it's naturally caught the attention of the legislature who have passed this legislation, the CAPTA legislation. So according to CAPTA, Neglect is the most common form of child abuse, and it appears in 71% of cases investigated. That's from their report in, I believe, 2008 or 2010. But 71% of cases that are investigated involve some form of neglect. Physical abuse is seen in 16% of cases that are investigated, sexual abuse in 9%, psychological maltreatment in 7%, medical neglect in 2%, and then other forms, all of those miscellaneous types of maltreatment that I discussed before, that's in 9% of cases. So these numbers, they may include various types of abuse or neglect. Neglect, it's usually covered in most of those categories as well, which is why that number is really high. Suffice to say, though, child abuse, it's a huge problem, and it has the potential to cost the government billions of dollars if left unresearched and unaddressed by Congress, which is why it led to this particular piece of legislation. This piece of legislation is, it's a funded piece of legislation, so the secretary under this legislation has the authority to grant funds to agencies and researchers and that sort of thing, just to try to understand, research, prevent, and just give general guidance to agencies on how to address the issue of child abuse. That being said, the legislation, it talks about how we need a comprehensive approach and really the culmination of minds, so to speak, so that the issue of child abuse can be addressed and can be improved. It's never going to go away. But the legislation itself is meant to help reduce those numbers and help prevent some of the abuse that occurs and that we see. So the legislation talks about how attacking the issue, it requires integrated work between various agencies. So agencies like social services, legal departments, DCS has a legal department, health agencies, mental health agencies, domestic violence services, education on child abuse and prevention, substance abuse agencies, and community-based organizations. So it involves all of those different types of organizations and professionals to work together to try to solve the issue and offer resources to help reduce those occurrences. It also involves coordination between various levels of government and professional organization. So it's child abuse is both a federal and a local issue, so to speak. So the federal government definitely has to cooperate with state governments to try to fund programs for abused individuals and for treatment of actually parents who commit those abuses against children. It also means that, private agencies, civic agencies, religious and professional organizations, and even just volunteers, they all have to coordinate together to make it work, so to speak. It also involves a true need for research, properly trained staff, and policy on it. So what it requires is information on prevention, a network of individuals to assess issues and to investigate allegations, and also just treatment in general at a neighborhood level. So that means like a lot of community-based efforts and that sort of thing. It also requires that properly trained staff be the people who are helping and developing these plans and investigations and that sort of thing. They need to have the proper qualifications and be properly trained in order to carry out their child protection duties. Also, it's important to recognize the different cultural, religious, and ethnic backgrounds and traditions in traditional child rearing, which means that some individuals of different cultural backgrounds may choose to child rear differently than others. So it's important to have a knowledgeable background and have professionals who are trained to understand the differences before, jumping the gun and getting families in trouble and invading their privacy in order to prosecute for child abuse and that sort of thing. So it takes an understanding to be able to prevent those issues arising. Also, under sections 109 and 114 of the legislation, the Secretary is granted the authority, the monitoring, and the oversight to ensure that the coordination of those programs and of those agencies are proper and effective, and to ensure that federal funds are granted when appropriate. I believe that the funds allocated are from the last piece of legislation that I saw, I think it was between 2011 and 2015, it was granted $120 million. So that was to be divvied up to various groups, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. Another thing that's in the legislation is the establishment of an advisory board on child abuse and neglect. So the legislation gives the Secretary the opportunity to create a board and appoint members from the general public who are knowledgeable in child abuse, neglect prevention, intervention, treatment, or research. And also to make sure that they are culturally diverse and representative of the group of individuals that they're protecting, right? So we're talking about members of the judiciary, we're talking about psychologists, social services, healthcare providers, organizations providing services to disabled people, organization providing services to children, teachers, volunteers, family rights groups, child rights activists, state and local government. We're talking about a culmination of entities and individuals to be appointed members of that type of board. Now, that board has a lot of important duties, their main ones being listed right above me, or I guess it's that way. Their duties include giving recommendations on child abuse, neglect, family violence prevention. So really just recommending how to coordinate federal, state, and local child abuse and neglect activities pertaining to family violence prevention, and also on how to reduce the amount of unfounded or unsubstantiated reports of child abuse, because that's a real issue. As you could see from the numbers presented earlier in the presentation, there are over 3 million investigations, but only 600,000 substantiated reports. So it's important that there are knowledgeable staff on the board to kind of develop these plans to reduce those numbers on unsubstantiated claims. So they're required to report and give recommendations for modifications for law to reduce those reports. Also to give recommendations for effective national data collection. So a really important part of this legislation, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is to, garner and disseminate information about child abuse, about prevention, and about treatment, which is, in the name. So it's really important that this board be able to give recommendations on what needs to be done and how to effectively coordinate a national level of data collection and dissemination. So moving on and talking about data some more, in the legislation, it also requires that the Secretary establish a national clearinghouse on child abuse information. So what that means basically is that all of the research and the data that is acquired is actually a compilation of research and data on various different things. So they're required to disseminate information on community-based programs, medical diagnosis and treatment of child abuse and neglect, best practices related to the response to child abuse. So that can be in how things are investigated or how to approach a victim. So like things like victim-centered approaches and that sort of thing. They're also required to maintain and disseminate information about achieving improvements in child protective services and systems, and also best practices relating to safe care for infants born of neonatal abstinence syndrome or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which basically means when the child is born testing positive for drugs or alcohol. They're also required to compile information on how many cases of child abuse are out there, the incident of the cases in different populations, information about adoption and family services and that sort of thing. Also about the amount of cases relating to substance abuse, and that sort of thing. They're also required to provide technical assistance to any of the programs or organizations that the grants go out to. And they're also supposed to provide training resources at both the state and local level to people who are engaged in the prevention, identification, or treatment of child abuse and neglect, and also in training law enforcement, the judiciary, medical professionals, different services like substance abuse treatment services or domestic violence service centers, child advocacy centers, all kinds of things. They're supposed to give some information and help with training to those different organizations as well. They're also supposed to disseminate information about family violence prevention and best practices for developing and carrying out collaboration between entities who provide child protective services or domestic violence services. So, moving on, research. We talked a little bit about that in this presentation, especially in that last slide. But research is a huge thing with prevention because it takes understanding, what is going on and understanding the underlying causes of child abuse to be able to make any difference, to be able to treat it properly, to be able to prevent it, and that sort of thing. So, what are they researching? The legislation outlines specifically different topics which may be broached, but it's not an all-encompassing list of things that they may research, but just more suggestions and things that should be researched. So we're talking about like just the nature and scope of child abuse. We're talking about socioeconomic distinctions between cases. We're talking relationship between children and parents. We're talking about the needs of special populations. We're talking about, root causes. We're talking about effective practices on treatment. We're talking about medical diagnosis and forensics. So forensics being like forensic interviewing in a child advocacy center. What that is basically when a child comes into the center because there's been an alleged abuse happening. The child will speak with a specialist. That specialist has to be trained in order to talk to the child and approach the situation and get information on what actually occurred. And then all of that's reviewed. But that has to be properly researched so we know how to do that and how to appropriately speak to the children, but also get the information that we need to move forward with investigating or prosecuting those issues. Also, information on how to best create a beneficial interagency collaboration. All of these things seem pretty obvious. There's a long list of things in the legislation. But all of these things are important to research and to understand so that we can actually make a difference and prevent some issues that happen and some allegations of abuse, and also know how to treat the victims, right? Also, results and reporting. The secretary is required by a certain date to prepare and submit basically a report on all of the findings of the research and all of the information contained in it to the Committee on Education and the Workforce of the House of Representatives and the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions of the Senate, so that they can review what's being done with the legislation and where all of the information is coming from. So, also, there are priorities that the Secretary is required to enforce. So the Secretary shall establish research priorities for making grants or contracts for purposes of carrying out the legislation. Also, they are required to provide an opportunity for public comment, but the priorities are really set or decided upon by the secretary and then can be chosen from those topics that we just talked about. Another interesting thing is it talked about all of these different topics in the legislation, but it made particular note of a study on shaken baby syndrome. So while I couldn't find much information on it, I would believe that someone in the legislature particularly wanted that research done on that type of disorder on shaken baby syndrome. So there's a whole section on what data needs to be collected on it and what research they would like to be done. Also, the Secretary is required to provide any technical assistance for all of those research and all of that. And also, they're required to work on demonstrative programs and projects. So that means that the Secretary can award grants, so money, to certain entities to assist in establishing and operating safe, family-friendly physical environments. That may include things like court-ordered supervised visitation between child and abusing parents, so a comfortable and safe space for that to happen, or also to facilitate the safe exchange of the children for visits with non-custodial parents in cases of things like domestic violence. So what that means is if there is domestic violence between the parents, let's say, for example, the father was harming the mother, the court may intervene and remove the child for those reasons. So they may have to remove the child from that dangerous situation and place them in a non-custodial parent's case to prevent, I guess, any harm to the child. So just having a safe area to be able to establish that exchange. Also, they are required to help with education, identification, prevention, and treatment. So the Secretary may award grants for projects that provide those sorts of things in cooperation with child care and early childhood education and care providers like preschools and elementary and secondary schools. So that means helping employees of schools understand what to look out for and how to identify and prevent abuse when they see it, and help them know when to report. A lot of schools have things like mandatory reporting that requires them to report when they suspect that a child is being abused. So grants can be awarded for training or demonstrations to those schools about those issues. Also, risk and safety assessment tools. So the Secretary can award grants to entities for projects that provide for the development of research-based strategies for risk and safety assessments relating to child abuse and neglect. So that just means that they can hand out money to or for projects that help develop strategies for understanding risk and safety issues relating to child abuse. And also, for training in general. We talked a little bit about training several times now, but the Secretary can award grants under that subsection for entities for projects that involved strategies for training for mandated child abuse and neglect reporters. So like with schools, if they have to train for that on what to look out for and how to do it and that sort of thing, then the Secretary can release funds for that as well. Moving on, let's talk about grants a little bit. So CAPTA has 4 main categories outlined in the legislation to various entities, including private organizations and agencies, states for prevention and treatment programs, states for programs relating to investigation and prosecution, and also for community-based treatment and prevention. So more specifically, it's talking about granting money for training programs, for triage procedures, so like things like screens and assessments and things like that, and also referral programs and things like that. Mutual support programs, collaboration between CPS, Child Protective Services, and Domestic Violence Service, and also to help link agencies. So basically a link between Child Protective Services and public health, or I guess mental health, substance abuse, that sort of thing, those sorts of agencies with child protective agencies in the state. And that just helps to create more programs that are available for treatment and prevention. Also, it helps to eradicate that issue that we talked about earlier with unsubstantiated claims. So these grants can lead to more development and more research on how to filter out those claims. In general, the grants can be awarded for very large things and also very small things. So it can be something as big as funding CPS for the month, or it could be something as small as eliminating barriers for families who are seeking to adopt children. It can be used, or grants in general can be used for many things, discretionary funds for supporting children of child abuse. It can be granted for, in general, just promoting safe and stable families. So providing services for foster families or adoptive families, and helping funding that transition for those children who are unfortunately removed from the home. These grants, they also usually carry a mandatory reporting. So usually these agencies who receive the grants are required to report to the Secretary about outcomes from the grants. So what the grants are going towards, are they actually helping to prevent or treat child abuse? What are the benefits to the grants and that sort of thing, so that the Secretary is updated on what's working and what's not working, and if they continue to give those grants to those organizations. And usually all of that is also compiled into a report that is given to the to Congress. So next up, we'll talk a little bit about community-based efforts. So what are those? In general, those are programs that are designed to be a local stop or prevention for child abuse. It also helps to coordinate initiatives and provide support, and also help the community understand and be more knowledgeable on child abuse and programs that are available and that sort of thing. It's typically a state-by-state thing. So each state has different child abuse prevention, like community-based child abuse prevention programs that they support. For instance, Tennessee, they define community-based child abuse prevention as helping to support community-based efforts to develop, enhance, and coordinate initiatives and activities to prevent child abuse, to support the coordination of resources and activities to help strengthen and support families, which can help to reduce the likelihood of child abuse and neglect, and also to help foster an understanding and appreciation and knowledge of diverse populations in order to effectively prevent and treat child abuse and neglect. Tennessee specifically uses funds for two programs, the Nurturing Parenting Program and the Darkness to Light Stewards of Children. The Nurturing Parenting Program, it's a family-centered initiative. It's designed to build nurturing parenting skills, which help to combat abusive or neglectful behaviors in parents, and it helps to prevent bad child rearing practices, so to speak, that can lead to abuse and neglect. It also has a wide variety of options for different cultural backgrounds, and it helps to target those at-risk populations, including parents of teens, parents of disabled children, first-time parents, parents who partake in drugs or alcohol, military families, all of those sorts of things. And they also include different classes, which may be done within a home or at one of their locations. The Darkness to Light Stewards of Children, that is a sexual abuse prevention program. It's a program that helps to train adults to recognize the signs and the warnings for child sexual abuse. It can help them to prevent and react in a beneficial way to a situation where sexual abuse is alleged. And it can help to motivate caregivers to act when they see something like that happening. Specifically, this program, the Darkness to Light Stewards, it's a 3-hour discussion-based training where trained facilitators, they come in and they discuss all of those issues, the signs, and things that adults can do to speak up and act when something is happening. Each state has their own eligibility requirements on who can participate in these types of programs. It's usually very, very state specific on who can do those sorts of things. For Tennessee specifically, it can be anybody who is free of alleged abuse, anybody who is conducting abuse or has a suspicion of abuse, anybody who is a family or individual who have come into contact with DCS at some point, whether the allegations are substantiated or unsubstantiated, they may be eligible to participate in those programs. And all of those programs are voluntary, so the people who are doing these can choose to go to those if they would like to. Other organizations that help with community-based efforts or focus on community-based efforts are Prevent Child Abuse America, Friends NRC, the Administration for Children and Families, and the National Center for Community-Based Child Abuse Prevention. They all have their own specific programs and assessments and that sort of thing, but they're all very beneficial in helping with community-based efforts. There are several issues with CAPTA that have been alleged by various groups. One particular group is the Children's Rights Group. They claim several different things, but mainly a failure to prevent or treat child abuse. They claim that in the 50 years now that CAPTA has been around, there has been no solid evidence to support that the law has reduced the mistreatment of children, or that it has prevented really much of anything. Instead, they claim that the CAPTA legislation has led to an invasion into family privacy. What they're saying with that is that the mandatory reporting requirement is an intrusion into the private life of families. 1 in 3 children will be subjected to a Child Protective Service investigation, and more than half of the Black children in America will be subjected to a CPS investigation at some point in their lives, in their childhood. So that creates a mistrust in the system. It creates a mistrust in, these resources, and it causes family to choose to not engage in the resources that they otherwise could be engaging in because of fear of ramifications. And an invasion into their lives, right? So they claim that it causes families who are investigated to be afraid to access social service resources, and they claim that it strips professionals like social workers and teachers and healthcare providers from their judgment and their ability to actually give these resources and to help these families, which is a big claim. They also claim that the system equates poverty with abuse. And they even wrote a letter to Congress claiming all of these things. And they say that poverty, it's not neglect. And instead of punishing child abuse, they are using poverty as a way to prove the allegations of abuse and neglect, which is, concerning, given that a majority of individuals who are investigated, it looks like my camera has frozen. So I will just turn off the camera and continue with the audio. But basically what they're saying is that there is a wide variation in the interpretation of what abuse and neglect is among the states, and that variation has led to these organizations like DCS and CPS to equate poverty with unsafe or neglectful or abusive homes for children, and so instead of acknowledging and helping with things like lack of access to food or housing or childcare and or mental health support and those sort of things, and addressing those and giving resources to families, they're afraid that it's actually causing them to remove children who otherwise, without those issues deriving from poverty, who would be staying in the home, which is it's a really big concern, and one that is probably has some weight behind it. There are several groups that are against CAPTA, including the Repeal CAPTA Work Group, who also worked on that piece, that letter to the Appropriations Committee in Congress for the CAPTA grants and things like that. So these issues, they're not unfounded. They have some merit behind them, and there is support behind it, given that CAPTA has been around for 50 years. That being said, the amount of money and funding and research that they have done have produced valuable results. So I don't know that me myself, I would agree that these issues are big enough to, repeal CAPTA or remove it, but rather maybe some revisions could be done and could be workshopped. But that being said, that is the end of my presentation. I hope that you all have learned a little bit about the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974. It's a really important piece of legislature, I think, because I think that child abuse is a huge, huge issue that costs the United States exorbitant amounts of money, and I believe that it is something that needs to be researched and prevented whenever possible. So I think pieces of legislation like this can be really helpful in combating child abuse, which is something that is on a lot of our radar. So thank you for listening to me for 45 minutes now. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you again.